ISIL fighters make territorial gains despite coalition airstrikes. The people fighting the group on the ground say that dropping bombs from the sky won't beat ISIL. So is the air campaign failing? And is a ground offensive the only answer? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. It's now 2 weeks into a Western-led aerial bombardment against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant that has, for the first time, targeted the group inside Syria. But there are concerns about whether the bombing is having an impact in driving back ISIL fighters. There's still intense fighting around the Syrian town of Kobani, along the border with Turkey. The town has been besieged by ISIL for weeks, and Kurdish fighters are warning that airstrikes won't be enough to defeat ISIL on the ground. It all adds to a feeling that the airstrikes are not having the decisive impact Western leaders said they would. ISIL fighters have proven agile in the face of aerial bombardment. Their fighters scatter when jets appear overhead, and they use civilian areas for cover. Even so, American military officials say their campaign is on track to, as they put it, degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL. These are some of the latest targets, according to the U.S. Central Command. In Syria, the U.S. says it has destroyed ISIL tanks and vehicles in Mayadin, as well as what are called ISIL firing positions in al-Raqqa. And in Iraq, U.S. fighter jets are said to have struck ISIL mortar teams in Fallujah, as well as other targets in Sinjar. But increasingly, fighters and military officials are saying airstrikes are simply not enough. Referring to the radical group by one of its other names, ISIS, the commander-in-chief of the Kirkuk province police force recently told Newsweek, "We appreciate all the airstrikes. We are thankful for this help and support. However, these airstrikes must keep escalating in numbers, and ground troops must be provided with military aid to drive out ISIS from their strongholds." Well, joining us now to discuss all these issues are our guests. In London, Matthew Henman, head of the IHS Jane's Terrorism and Insurgency Centre. In Washington, D.C., David Pollock, senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And also in London, Haldun Solzmaturk, a former brigadier general of the Turkish military. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Haldun Solzmaturk. The simple question, how effective is the aerial campaign against ISIL?
As far as I can see and follow, it has been as effective as possible. In other words, as effective as any air campaign could be. It is degrading the force and the power and the combat capability of ISIL, but I don't think this will be enough to destroy it.
David Pollock, your view?
I think that I agree with that, but I also would add that there's a difference between Syria and Iraq. I think in Iraq, the airstrikes have been effective in a defensive mode, that is, preventing ISIL from advancing against Erbil and helping to keep the Haditha and Mosul dams in the hands of Iraqi and Kurdish forces. But in Syria, it I think is not very effective, and we can see that in Kobani, where ISIL looks like it is going to succeed eventually in overrunning that city on the Turkish border, and in other parts of the country where its hold on Raqqa and other cities in eastern Syria or around Aleppo has not really been damaged. So I would say that partly this is because the tempo of the number, in other words, of airstrikes in Iraq is much larger than in Syria, and also because in Iraq there are local, I emphasize, ground forces, Iraqi, Arab, and Kurdish units and militias that are able to follow up the airstrikes with ground action. That's not the case in Syria.
Matthew Henman, your view, do you think it is correct to separate out northern Iraq and Syria in terms of the effectiveness of aerial attack?
Absolutely. I mean, they're different for starters, for tactical purposes. As the previous speaker just correctly elaborated, in Iraq, the airstrikes are typically for offensive purposes, to prevent the Islamic State from advancing on particular areas, to try and create a sense of operational space so that local security forces there and the Peshmerga, etc., can get a sense of operational momentum and start pushing the Islamic State back. Whereas in Syria they have to be very much more strategic in terms of trying to destroy Islamic State infrastructure, destroy facilities, etc.
Well, David Pollock, your view, is this a kind of thought of one size fits all? We've got an air operation going in northern Iraq. Well, let's do that in Syria as well.
No, I think actually at least from an American government and military standpoint, the operations in Syria are much more constrained by various bureaucratic and legalistic issues, whether in the field or in Washington. And so it's actually much harder for the U.S. to conduct rapid and massive or even substantial airstrikes in Syria than it is in Iraq. So it's true, as you say, that these are both airstrike campaigns without any ground or any significant ground component from outside forces. But the nature of the campaign is quite different, and I think the result, unfortunately, is that we're not likely to be very effective in Syria, even though we are likely to be, and we are, I think, being effective in Iraq.
Well, Halden Solzma-Turk, it was significant that the U.S. pushed for the campaign to be extended into Syria following the gruesome public killing of Westerners. In a way, it almost seemed as though there was a real drive to be seen to be doing something in response to these acts. Do you think that the desire to be seen to be doing something was a major motivating force in terms of sparking off the aerial campaign in Syria?
This is partly true, but of course this is just part of the overall story. I mean, looking at the phenomenon called ISIL, one cannot differentiate between the Iraqi ISIL and the ISIL in Syria. We are looking at the same so-called, the organization, the army, the institution, which calls themselves a state. So it wouldn't make any sense, neither politically nor militarily, to attack, the portions or the troops or the elements in Iraq, but not those in Syria. I mean, it's just normal, inevitable that one has to, engage the ISIL troops in Syria as well. But I agree, there are some problems, not only administrative, legalistic, but also some ideological and most importantly, political problems, as far as the air campaign and the larger military campaign is concerned in Syria.
Well, Matthew Henman, on that particular issue, the campaign in Syria in particular, there is no UN go-ahead, no UN discussion. The forces were certainly not invited in by the government, which is supposedly still in power within Syria. There are legal issues, are there not, in terms of international law with this campaign in Syria?
To a certain degree. I mean, I think you've hit upon kind of one of the key constraints in terms of the differentiations between the airstrikes in Iraq and the ones in Syria. Obviously, with the airstrike campaign in Iraq, the idea is very much to empower the Iraqi government to push back the Islamic State, whereas in Syria, obviously, it's a much more delicate situation whereby the US government is seeking to both degrade and destroy the Islamic State, but also to avoid inadvertently, in that sense, empowering the government of President Assad. So it's in the very difficult position of trying to carry out airstrikes and an air campaign in a way which allows it to, at the same time, destroy the Islamic State, but prevent the Assad government from gaining an advantage from that. So it's walking a very long tightrope in that sense.
David Pollock, as well, there seems to be the sense, as certainly critics contend it is, that the default position of the Obama administration when faced with conflict situations is bomb them, be it planes, be it aircraft, be it drones. This has been the default position throughout the Obama presidency, the attempting to deal with conflict situations without putting people on the ground and, in fact, to conduct operations from the air. Is this a continuation of this type of policy, this type of default position, which Obama seems to reach to on every occasion?
Well, I agree that President Obama and this U.S. administration are extremely reluctant to put additional U.S. ground forces into action in foreign countries. But I don't agree that the default option is simply to bomb anywhere and everywhere at any time. I think, in fact, the U.S. was actually quite late in doing even airstrikes, either in Iraq or in Syria, and waited for years until American public opinion changed dramatically as a result of ISIS victories and of ISIS propaganda, including the beheading videos. And of course, if you look elsewhere around the world at the crisis in Ukraine, for example, or other crises, the U.S. is not bombing in any of those places. So I think it would be worth making some of these distinctions rather than sweeping generalizations.
Point taken. I'm against sweeping generalizations generally, but Holden Solsma-Turk, that whole issue, though, of conducting the campaign in Syria, choosing to conduct a campaign against ISIL, despite months of requests of pleading from some of the parties involved in Syria for a campaign to be conducted against the Syrian government, which was the original focus of coalition actions, non-military actions within Syria. There is a great deal of resentment on the ground within Syria among certain parties in this conflict, is there not?
Yes, you're right. But let's try to be realistic. I mean, there is no perfect solution, neither in politics nor in military campaigns, that would, address all your needs and requirements and expectations and wishes. I mean, we are living in a world of facts. The facts are there. I mean, I cannot see any solution while attacking or fighting ISIL in Syria, but also preventing the Bashar al-Assad government, not getting any gain from this. I mean, apart from anything else, this is relative. In terms of relative, power balance, if you are fighting, ISIL, you are providing an advantage to Assad. I mean, I think the situation currently is too serious to lose time for such considerations. I mean, from an objective observer's point of view, it's inevitable. I mean, if you really would like to determined to fight ISIL in Syria, you have to cooperate with, Bashar al-Assad government in one way or another, directly or indirectly.
Well, this is the nuances, David Pollock, that we were referring to a few minutes ago. This is a very complex and complicated situation in terms of diplomacy and in terms of military action, is it not?
Yes, absolutely right. And I agree with my Turkish colleague as well that we're faced with a dilemma here that has no perfect solution. And in fact, it is unfortunately an unintended consequence of hitting ISIL in Syria that it probably does, at least temporarily, strengthen Assad. But from that standpoint, I would just add that in my own personal view, it is a mistake for the United States to hit other Syrian opposition forces, even Islamist ones, even al-Qaeda affiliated ones like Jabhat al-Nusra or Ahrar al-Sham in Syria, because I think the targeting should be focused only on ISIL. And keeping it that way in the future, which I think we may have decided to change in that direction, keeping it that way, just ISIL, all the time, would help prevent some of the resentment among Syrian opposition elements that you mentioned a few moments ago.
Matthew Henman, that is a valid point, and yet here we're getting to the difficulty of conducting an aerial attack is to be able to select your targets. If you want to select ISIL, you have to be very precise about hitting at ISIL. Now, the first round of attacks in Syria actually included some other groups as well, as David Pollock pointed out there. And yet here you're getting back to that precise problem with aerial activity. It is very difficult to get precise targets without some form of grouping on the ground, is it not?
Absolutely, and I think that's why, to a certain extent, we haven't seen as greater involvement in terms of airstrikes in Syria to date, particularly, as you mentioned, around the town of Kobane, because, as you rightly pointed out at the start of the programme, the Islamic State has adapted to a certain extent to these airstrikes. They've been expecting them, and so they've melted into the civilian population. They're operating from civilian areas, and particularly with the push on Kobane, they've operated in a way that makes it very difficult for Western powers to launch airstrikes against them without endangering the civilian population, because the US government, Western governments are aware more than perhaps anything else of the unbelievably negative repercussions that unwarranted civilian casualties in these airstrikes will cause to them, and ultimately to the success of the campaign.
Now, hold on, Solzberg, there's another issue here as well, and as a former military person, it's something that is studied in textbooks. Fighting an insurgency is very different from fighting against governments. Fighting against an insurgency, you have no command and control centers that you can direct your attacks at. It is very different from affecting some kind of regime change, as was done in the Iraq War, for example, the most recent Iraq War. This is a tactic that is very difficult to carry out, to direct attacks at insurgencies from the air, is it not? And very seldom, very, very seldom, has it ever been successful.
You are absolutely right. I mean, in an insurgency, actually, you are not fighting the insurgents. You are fighting the perception. You are fighting the hearts and minds of the population who are supporting this insurgency or this force, this movement. So a military campaign, not only from the air, but a full-scale, joint combined military campaign should have to be complemented with an information operations campaign and also with the kind of public diplomacy campaign. I mean, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to win such a war by military force only, let alone airstrikes. You're right.
Well, Matthew Henman, I mean, it was summed up in one leader article in a newspaper in the course of the day. You cannot bomb an ideology. To what extent is that an accurate statement?
It's very true. I mean, one of the key things to bear in mind here is that these airstrikes won't have come as a surprise to the Islamic State. They weren't only expecting them to happen, they've been anticipating them and actively trying to work towards this Western campaign beginning against it in Iraq and Syria. It's more than aware of the fact that these bombing campaigns only give the group added legitimacy within its own community. It gives it increased power when it comes to recruitment activities, etc., for propaganda purposes, etc., etc. So the group wasn't surprised by this. The group knew that such a campaign ultimately wouldn't destroy the group and isn't likely to destroy the group in the coming days. I mean, I just want to go back to the previous point you made, though, about how difficult it is to kind of bomb to win an insurgency just by bombing alone. It's worth pointing out that with the territorial control that the group currently has in both Iraq and Syria, with the access to kind of conventional arms and munitions that the group does, and with the way that they prosecute their military campaigns in both Iraq and Syria in terms of positional warfare, this is almost much more akin to fighting a conventional enemy than it is to a sub-state actor. So one of the key things that the Western powers have been looking to do with airstrikes is to prevent the kind of mass territorial attacks that we've seen in Kobani, but also continuing in Iraq at the moment. And I guess one of the key measures that we're seeing in terms of the failure of these airstrikes, particularly in Iraq, is the fact that the group is still able to carry out massed attacks against fixed positions and urban centres. Over the weekend, we saw the vast majority of the town of Hit in Anbar captured by the Islamic State. And just 3 weekends ago, we saw the Camp Saklawiya attack, where a large Iraqi military base in Anbar province was captured and overrun with several hundred Iraqi soldiers killed. I mean, these are exactly the kinds of attacks that airstrikes should theoretically be preventing taking place, where you have massed ranks of the enemy gathering, but they're failing to do so.
Well, David Pollock, there has been the controversial claim that the aerial campaign within Syria is playing directly into the hands of ISIL. It is creating, some contend, greater support for the group on the ground. It is dividing certain elements within Syria, and in a way, it has been prompted or motivated by ISIL themselves as part of a tactic. What do you think of that contention?
No, I understand the idea that you're raising, but I don't agree with it. I think there's no evidence that I know of that people in Syria are, on the whole, sympathetic to ISIL, let alone more sympathetic to it since the airstrikes have started. I think if you ask people in towns that ISIS controls by violence and intimidation, they're not happy with it at all. And if you look at Kobani, for example, what you see, which is under siege by ISIS right now near the Turkish border, you see the spokespeople for the local community constantly asking for more airstrikes in order to save them from massacre or conquest by these extremists who are utterly opposed to the local population, which is mostly Kurdish. And so I think that there's really no merit to the notion that airstrikes are increasing the popularity of ISIS, either in Syria or in Iraq.
Haldun Solzma-Turk, I want to go to the issue too of mission creep, that cliched phrase of how operations actually start increasing in intensity with unforeseen circumstances sometimes. For example, the Stars and Stripes is reporting that combat helicopters are now being deployed in northern Iraq. You now, as one writer put it, have boots in the air, not yet on the ground. But moving combat helicopters into a conflict campaign is a very different affair from flying fighter aircraft or drones way above the conflict zone, is it not?
From military perspective, this makes sense. I mean, but combat helicopters or attack helicopters, how we call it in military terminology, would help much. But they are part of the army. I mean, they are army helicopters, and this concept was tried in Libya. At the beginning, it was more or less like what we are observing, monitoring in Syria and Iraq now. And then at some stage, people started asking similar questions, as we are talking about now for Libya. And then combat helicopters or attack helicopters were introduced through various channels, national, NATO, etc. But then at some stage, people came to realizing that even attack helicopters would not be enough. That then came the boots on the ground. And even if it's only combat helicopters, effective, still you need to have some boots on the ground just in order to support them, to protect and to defend their helicopter bases, etc.
Well, at that particular point, my thanks to our guests for talking us through these complexities, Matthew Henman, David Pollock, and Haldun Solzma-Turk. And thank you too for watching. Feel free to add your voice to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna from me and the team. Goodbye for now.